missed a little bit of the development of Paris. So we were just doing some city analysis. Not this one, but...
Absolutist city planning.
Yes. Okay. So Paris started... Paris started in Roman times, and it was a blend between a Roman castrum and then the native people, which are called Gallic people. So in the year 360, when we are still Roman, we have our first establishment on this island, which is later going to be called the Ile de la Cité, or the island of the city. Then Rome has its downfall, so around 100 years or 50 years after Rome falls, we now begin the reign of Clovis, the first king of the Franks, otherwise known as the French. So this is to establish the fact that the idea of being French and the identity of being French is established back in 500. And that's why the Germanic principalities in 1700 are having so many issues, because they don't have this long of a history of being whatever they are, Czech or Slavic or Habsburgs. But Paris does. So relatively stable state by the time you get there. Now notice we have our Roman grid. So we know that somewhere between the year 360 and the fall of Rome in 476, around 100 years, we have the establishment of a castrum that is then taken by the king of the Franks and is walled, because this is a medieval age and it is dangerous. So now we have to wall not only our inner city, but our new establishment. And notice that we have a little faubourg down here. Now we have around 500 years after that, we have our Capetian dynasty, which is the ancestor to all the modern day French monarchs. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then a 7th faubourg at this point. So we know that eventually we want to grow our city a lot over here and a little over here to fit the demands of the population. And then the Louvre is that. So it's a fort right now. So now we get to the beginning of the Renaissance, not quite yet, but we see a mini bastion here, so we have hints of it. We also see that the former faubourgs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the 6th one, are now in the wall.
Yeah.
So now they are paying taxes, and we have new faubourgs forming on the outskirts of that new wall. By 1575, we now have Catherine de' Medici, who's the mother of Henry III. Remember, she is our Medici princess that brings in the Renaissance to France, right? So we're beginning to see bigger bastions begin to form, and the idea of using our River Seine as a moat around the whole entirety of Paris. But we're not quite there yet, because these take years and years to build. So we're starting first here, and eventually we'll get to the rest of them. Now the Ile de la Cité, you'll notice, is beginning to have population on its bridges. Were you here at that point?
Yeah.
Okay. And then our Louvre fortress is here, and Catherine builds her palace outside of the city walls, which is that extra branch of the Louvre that I later showed you. And then by this point, this is now Henry III's child, so her grandson has now completed the vision of having all the bastions around, and he's left extra room because he knows Paris wants to expand. And then this is where we see the inclusion of our first open square right here, right? That didn't just happen naturally, it was made on purpose, because we look at the grain of all this and there's really no space that's that neat or that open in the city. So this is quite new, and Henry IV establishes it. And by the way, you can see he's connected the fort to the palace at this point. So he establishes it, this is him, to become a French square. So French squares are always made by a royal family, and they have 3 consistent features. They are 1, a geometric cutout of the city. So it could be a square, circle, triangle, usually a square circle. It has uniform facades because it is controlled by the king and his architect. They don't want it to look ugly. And 3, it has a central focus on the glory of the king. Usually it's going to be a statue right in the center, but it could also be a big triumphal column with a statue at the top. And that's the Place Royale. And then we talked about it being made for silk merchants. Did you hear that part?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so we have somewhat matching facades going around. And although they're beginning to look Renaissance-y, right, they don't necessarily have columns on them yet or pediments. So we know that we have hints of introductory Renaissance ideals, but we're not quite there yet. And we see that because we have things like broken pediments, no columns, but we have coins. So we're kind of getting there. And then we have arcading all along the bottom. If you recall, when we talked about New Bastide foundations, there was an arcade around the whole square, and it was to attract merchants. Already, we know that he's a different type of monarch who's taking a lot of influence from his Italian family. So, French squares largely arise during the 17th century, which is called the Grand Sequel or the Grand Century of France. This is when France reaches its absolute height in power. We have the idea that the king rules everything at this time. And we also have France establishing its colonies. So if you have a city that has original French colonial activities, keep an eye out for the idea of squares, right? Specifically, if you're Detroit or New Orleans, the idea of squares is going to be big because of who colonized those towns. Now, the three consistent features of our French squares are going to be number one, it does have to be somewhat geometrically aligned because they are borrowing Renaissance ideas. We usually want it to be symmetrical, proportional, harmonious, which is going to be a square, a circle, and in some cases, triangles. We also want uniform facades established all the way around that square, right? Because it's the king that's overseeing this, he has the power, authority, and the money in order to invest into this project so that all the facades around it look exactly the same. And lastly, because it is commissioned by the king, we also need a central display of power, usually a statue, what do we call them? The column, the triumphal columns that have the big statues on top. That's usually what's going to go in the center of these squares. So these are the three components. We will see that the function of them switches at some points, right? But usually, these are the three things that we are looking for. So, the first one, the first large one that we saw on that map is the Place Royale. So Place just means plaza, right, or piazza, so we're using all the different names, but they're all the same thing, some sort of city square. So the Place Royale we can see is quite large in the context of this dense urban grain. We're taking up around the space of 4 blocks or so, right? And again, to do that, you do need a certain level of master planning, and to do that, you need an architect and you need a provider for the monetary means to make this. So we have our king. In the center, we see our display of power. So we have a pedestal that is solely meant to have the statue of the king on it. And then all the way around, we do have our matching facades. And notice that, of course, it is geometrically cut out of the fabric, right? It's not just a freestanding square. It was cut out of something that was already there. This is what it looks like. We can see our nice matching facades, central pavilions, the materials, everything about this is quite consistent. There's a statue. And the funny thing about a lot of these is even though you construct it for yourself, the next king could easily just change out the statue for his own and so forth. So we do see Napoleon, when he's emperor of France, he pretty much replaces all of them with himself. Then once he gets taken out, they replace them and put back the original monarchs. Here's what the facades look like today, where we can see matching materials, right? We have a sense of harmony, of balance, of hierarchy, even where we see that there is, a central pavilion placed on this, which we see here. And the streets that connect into this square actually come through the facade. So if you look behind that square, you can use this archway as part of your streetscape, and then you drive around the periphery of that square. So compared to what we saw in Vigevano, right, where they blocked it with the columns because the ruler didn't care enough about the merchants or the roads, what we see here is that there is a great care to dignify the entrance into the square, to not break the uniformity, but also not ruin how functional these streets are. And once again, we see a little bit of that Renaissance influence in the way that they're using the coins on the corners, right? The way that we're using the reservoirs on the arches, though it's not perfectly correct just yet because it is early Renaissance, we do see the ideas are there. Now on the ground floor, we do have spaces for merchants, specifically for silk merchants. So the story behind this square is Henry IV is financially recovering from a war. Usually the case with a lot of these monarchies, they're always recovering from some kind of war. Now Henry IV specifically was fighting with Italy, not the whole Italian peninsula, but one of the duchies in Italy. And so because of that, he's now enemies with that specific group of people, and they happen to be importing all of the silk from the Ottoman Empire. And so what he does is he creates a home industry of silk, and he plans to put it inside the Place Royale. Now ultimately, that fails, right? It sounds great in theory. You now have, your silk merchants here, and people can easily purchase in the city, but it doesn't work out because silk merchants cannot afford to be living in these grand apartments up here. So Henry's idea was you work on the bottom floor and you live on the upper floors. But look at how luxurious this is compared to medieval Paris, and the merchants simply cannot afford it. And so, although many of them keep some shops here, the upper floors remain pretty vacant. And what happens is it turns into a courtier square, right? So it goes from being originally meant for our silk merchants to being meant for people in the king's court, because really they're the only ones that can afford to be living in a place that's nice as this. The next square that we're going to be talking about is going to be located on our central island. So this is what we call the Ile de la Cité, or the island of the city. Remember that that is the original establishment of the city of Paris. This is where it all began, meaning that this is going to be the strong core of both commerce and also administration. So we have our law courts that are going to be located in the old palace right here. And then does anyone recognize this structure right here? What is that? Yes, so Notre Dame, our Gothic cathedral, right, is going to be located right on the Ile de la Cité. And notice that it's the largest thing, right? It towers over everything else. So we truly see that quest for verticality and why the Parisians were so interested in it, right? Because they wanted to dominate their skyline and be able to compete with what is going on with the Italian Duomos on the peninsula and also what's going on in Rome. And they're quite successful. It really dominates the whole city. But for today, we're going to be looking at this bottom portion of the Ile de la Cité down here. So I've zoomed in. These are the bridges that connect the upper part of the Ile de la Cité, and then this is the new bridge that is constructed. What are some differences between the old bridge and then the new bridge? Yes?
I can't see it very well, but is that like, there's like urban fabric attached to the bridge, kind of like buildings and stuff?
Yes. Has anyone here been to Lake Las Vegas? Yeah, so you know how there's this bridge going over the lake and then it's kind of like shops on the sides? It was an enclosed bridge. So that is how bridges used to be constructed during this time, right? During medieval time, bridges were fully enclosed. So all these little rows you see up here are townhomes, and there are businesses being run out of them. And the reason why this happens is because it's profitable, right? People are constantly moving from the Ile de la Cité to the rest of Paris. So lots of commerce runs through here, which is great if you're a merchant. And second, it's a lot cheaper, right? Because at some point, this was not a bridge that had homes on it. It was simply a nice open bridge. But because the bridges were so wide, people thought, well, why don't I just build my house and my business on top of that bridge? Right, I'm not going to go all the way to the edge of town where the land is. I'm going to go here. And because there's no codes or regulations at the time, this is what ends up happening. And you can see that this one has like 2 streets going through it. And so that bridge was really widened in order to have even more homes be on it. Now this is highly dangerous. Number one, it catches fire super easily, which allows it to spread from one part of the city to the other. And number two, you literally have water running under the homes. So if you do not have enough stability on the piers of your bridge and you put too much weight on it, which wasn't foreseen at the beginning, it will collapse. And once you have a collapse, you've pretty much blocked an artery of trade. The Seine is lucky enough to have 2 arteries, right? So if one bridge falls, we can go through the other way. But still, it's not a great place to be in. And then when you think about the fact that sewage did not exist at this time, they really are dumping stuff out of the bridges straight into the river. And if you're trading on that river, you really want to have a good cover on your boat. Now, during this time, once again, we're having new Renaissance ideas come in. And so this is starting to look very medieval and, not very nice. And they want to beautify the city, and they create what we call the New Bridge, or the Pont Neuf, which is on the southern point over here. And this is going to be the first open bridge in Paris. So it's the first time in the history of Paris that a bridge is built to be specifically wide enough for lots of traveling and also open. So no one was allowed to settle on this bridge. And what we have attached to it back here is another one of Henry IV's squares, or in this case, a triangle. Right, so just a small comparison, this is what it looked like before. So we have our ancient castle, like before the Louvre over here, our ancient fortress, which later became the Ministry of Justice. So has anyone here watched the Hunchback of Notre Dame? So there's this scene where it shows the cathedral, and then the evil guy Frollo is in his palace. So we're referencing this right here. So that whole movie really just takes place on this island, which tells you the scale of Paris at the time. Now this bottom portion here are the original gardens, and if you recall when we talked about Pienza, I told you about the enclosed medieval gardens, right? So we're seeing we have a medieval garden down here, and then Henry IV decides, let's take away a little bit of this, royal land and give it back to the people of Paris. And he creates the Place Dauphine. A Dauphin is the heir to the throne. That is what you call the firstborn son of a French king. So this is what it looked like before all these alterations. So again, you can see Notre Dame's two towers in the back. It was a sort of low, non-embanked land down here, right? And we see that we have the Pont Neuf beginning to emerge. This was a former king's project. And then Henry IV, again trying to increase trade and wealth revenue into the city itself, decides that he's going to take it upon himself to finish this bridge. And you can see the other end of it just right here. And so today it looks like this, right? So we have the full bridge completed. We now have the Place Dauphine on the end over here, and it is now fully embanked. Embankment, again, just means that we have concrete walls coming down the canal rather than a natural riverbed, which allows you to maximize the amount of land you can build on, right? So we go from this to this. Now, in the foreground, what do we see? What kind of structure is this? And I'll give you guys a hint. This is what it looks like today, if you can recognize this form. Not a palace. Yes, the French version of a palazzo, a palace. This is the Louvre in the foreground. So this is once it becomes a palace, which is what it looks like today. And then this is what it looked like at the time. Remember that the Louvre was originally a fortress. We'll get back to that in a second. I just wanted to show you guys. And so now we have this new bridge down here at the bottom connecting new arteries to the city. So we're increasing trade. And we have a new place down here in which we can also house more merchants. Now in theory, because we're trying to be Renaissance thinkers and designers, we do want harmony and proportion. So ideally, the Place Dauphine should look like this, where it's perfectly symmetrical and we have the same angle on both sides. But because the island is not perfectly symmetrical, we actually end up with something more like this. But you can't necessarily tell because they're using matching facades and they're trying to create this illusion that it is a perfectly symmetrical space. Excuse me. Where else do we see this technique being used, where they use identical facades to hide the fact that something is not perfectly symmetrical? Yes.
I forget if it's
The Trivium at the Piazza del Popolo.
Yes.
Yes. So we remember they have the twin churches to hide the fact that those branches are not even. We have a very similar technique going on here. Now you'll notice that the plan, again, in theory, should all be perfectly even and have pretty uniform room sizes. But in practice, what's behind the facades is really not all that even, right? So if you're a wealthy merchant, you might end up with this one, which is a connection of 3 townhomes and make a really nice urban palazzo of sorts. And if you're a not so wealthy merchant, you might just be stuck with this little square over here. And so as you begin to give liberty to people to buy as many plots as they want and do whatever they want inside of them, we begin to lose a little bit of the uniformity on the interior of the actual project. So this, it's kind of a misleading graphic, but this is assuming we're standing on the bridge at the end of the island, looking back at the island, and so the branches are actually coming out this way and that way, but because of perspective, we don't see it. But you can see that we're trying to create a sense of symmetry, right? The end facades look exactly the same. We don't necessarily see the angles that are going on, and because we are looking at it from a human perspective, we do not sense that they are not symmetrical. And so, it looks like this really nice Renaissance space that is created at the end of the Ile de la Cité. Notice that we do have a couple of sort of temporary merchant spaces over here, right? They've set up, but these are not established homes, right? They're not straight up constructing buildings on the bridge. It is now a lot wider. This is a highly exaggerated image. It's not that wide, but it is a lot wider, right? And they're trying to really sell the image. So this is propaganda for the Place de Fon and the Pont Neuf, where we're trying to show, look how wide this new road is. Isn't it nice? Shouldn't we fund more of these on the rest of it instead of having this stuff back here? As per usual, we do need our statue of the king. In this case, it's going to be right on the bridge, so that as you look through the Place de Fon, where it opens up, you do have his statue. So he's not just a patron of the plaza, but also the bridge. And then this is inside the actual Place de Fon. Now, because a lot of time has passed, not all the facades are matching, but this is an example of what the original facade would have looked like over here, which looks pretty close to what Place Royale is trying to do. Now, once again, notice that on the bottom floors, we do have arcading going on, and to this day, all of these are still businesses. So this is another example of Henry IV trying to increase the amount of spaces that there were for merchants. When you give merchants spaces to have nice businesses, they're going to be quite happy with you. They're going to support you, they're going to give you a loan to help you get out of debt, and so forth. And so we see another space that was made for commercial purposes. And of course, it frames his statue quite nicely at the end of that plaza. Now, eventually, we get to the end of the Grand Cycle of France, and we have Louis XIV. So this is the famous Sun King. You know, we've talked about him extensively. He is the patron of Versailles and so forth. So Louis XIV is also involved with this idea of squares. It's been around 50 years since Henry IV gave his original squares, and Louis XIV has a different idea on what the squares should do. Now, he decides to create them in a very similar fashion, so they are still geometric. In this case, we have a circle, we still have matching facades, and we still have the statue of the king. So in theory, it's the same prototype. But in practice, when we look at images like these, do you see any kind of merchant activity going on here?
No.
No, we don't. And largely, if you look at the people and look at the way they're dressed, right, they have canes, they're wearing their nice culottes, they're dressed like courtiers because they are courtiers. Carriages, we have a couple of people like sparring over there back before it was illegal. So what we have here are the wealthy nobility, because this square was not meant to have commercial purposes. It was purely for self-glorification. So we see it go from being a commercial endeavor in Henry IV's time to now being a more self-glorification endeavor in Louis XIV's reign, which goes in line with who Louis XIV is, right? He is the symbol of absolutism. Another one he creates is the Place Mignon, which is a very similar type of idea. In this case, it is a octagon of sorts. And notice once again the type of people that inhabit this square. We have carriages, right? We have courtiers, we have little kids that are playing around. If you are the child of a poor family, you're not going to have time to be playing around. So we know that this is a wealthy class. We also have some military. influence in here. So we know that it belongs to the king, and more specifically to his courtiers again. So this is another square created by Louis XIV that does not have commercial purposes. And notice that there are no loggias, that is perfectly enclosed on the bottom, so that no merchants bring their ugly little stands and ruin the beauty of the space. And so that it's purely for, again, his self-glorification. Now, the facades themselves are quite interesting, and they tell us a little bit about what's going on at the time as well. So we have our nice rusticated base, right? We're beginning to have a nicer sense of our orders. So we see Renaissance has really picked up at this point in France. And this is what the facades look like inside the Place Vendôme. What does this look like? What structure does this remind you guys of? This was an archetype that was set up by a very specific building we talked about last semester. Yes?
Was the French palace in the Louvre?
The Louvre, yes. The Louvre, if you guys recall, had its rusticated base, its colossal colonnade, its central pavilion, and its end pavilions, which is exactly what we see going on here. And so we know we're talking about the same time period, and that this was created to, again, remind us that this was created by the king, and in order to dignify the courtiers, right? They're not living at the Louvre, but they're living in a Louvre of sorts. All right, so a little bit of history on the Louvre, because now we're going to be talking about the history of the French palace. Right, so we talked about French squares and the symbolism behind those. Now we're going to talk about the secondary archetype that is the symbol of absolutism, which is the palace. Last semester, I didn't talk too much about them, but today we're going to talk extensively about the prototypes. So originally, the Louvre was located right here. And this was where the old French city wall used to go, right? So the city wall of Paris ended right here. And so the Louvre is a sort of fort, very similar to what the Estates had, right? They were there in order to protect the citizens inside of the Parisian walls. Now remember I told you Catherine de' Medici builds her palace, which is this little portion down here, and she creates these adjacent gardens. And then eventually we have some other king that decides, let me just connect the two of them really quickly, right? And so now the Louvre is this huge, long thing. It's like the biggest structure in terms of area in Paris. So let's see if the volume works on this. It does. So this is a short history of the Louvre and all the changes it's undergone.
From a medieval fortress to an art museum, the Louvre Palace has undergone 8 centuries of architectural transformation, making it an embodiment of French history. In the Middle Ages, to protect the city, King Philippe Auguste built a square defensive fortress between the Seine and the walls of Paris. 1.5 centuries later, in the heart of the city now enclosed by a new outer wall, the Louvre fortress was converted into a royal residence by King Charles V. François I used the castle as his main residence, but it was his son, Henri II, who had the first wing of the modern palace built, which would become a prime example of the French Renaissance style. When Henri II died, his widow, Catherine de' Medici, started building and designing the Tuileries Palace and its gardens for her personal use outside the city walls. King Henri IV had the Grande Galerie built on the waterfront to join the Louvre to the Tuileries Palace.
So Henry IV is the king we're talking about. He's the one commissioning all these city squares, and this was another one of his projects, the big arcade on the bottom here.
At 460 meters, it was the longest building ever seen in Paris, and the first milestone of an ambitious project that would continue under his successors. At the beginning of his reign, Louis XIV had the Cour Carrée made to its current dimensions, and extended the Tuileries Palace, where he lived before leaving the Louvre to move permanently to the Château de Versailles. The Tuileries was used as the seat of power during the French Revolution. In 1793, the Muséum Central des Arts opened in the Grande Galerie of the Louvre. Emperor Napoleon I created a focal point for the Tuileries Gardens with the Arc de Carrousel, dedicated to his armies, and had a gallery constructed to unite the northern parts of the two palaces. To complete the works to unite the Louvre and Tuileries that had been ongoing since Henri IV's reign, Emperor Napoleon III boosted reconstruction efforts and built new wings on either side of the Pro Napoleon. He doubled the size of the Louvre and completed the great architectural project undertaken by the kings of France. The Louvre survived the town fire of 1871 that engulfed the Tuileries Palace almost scathe-free. Once the ruins had been fully removed in 1883, the Louvre continued to change, acquiring its symbolic glass pyramid, marking the entrance to the museum in the 20th century.
All right, so hopefully that gives you a better idea of how it's evolved from becoming a fortress into becoming an actual palace. And also, by the way, when they did build those new wings right here, this was the School of Architecture at the time in France, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. So if you guys were students during this time, you would be studying the Louvre. Now, in terms of urban fabric, we see that we have a new addition. Well, let me talk about the facade really quickly. So the facade of the Louvre was originally supposed to look like this, right? At this point, we have Louis XIV, and he's like, let me give it a facelift because it's looking a little too medieval. Specifically looking at this side over here, which is the one that faces the rest of Paris. So he wants to improve it and make it a little bit nicer. And he invites Bernini from Italy. Remember, Bernini's the one doing all these amazing Baroque works, and so surely if Bernini's making the Piazza for St. Peter's and the Scala Regia, he can make something grand enough for a French king. And these are his proposals, which I've told you before were much too voluptuous, right? And the French didn't really like them. Bernini was also quite arrogant, right, which the king obviously was not going to like. Bernini came with a secondary idea, which we can see is also very curvy, very much in the Roman fashion. And so Bernini is fired, and we instead have Claude Perrault design what is today the iconic Louvre facade. And this becomes the archetype for the French palace. Now the French like this because it's a lot more simple and what they called elegant, right? The way in which they are using the orders is much more controlled. We have a rusticated base at the bottom, right? So this is where all the service goes, horses, servants, everything that makes the palace function is on the bottom floor. We have our colossal colonnade, and recall it is not colossal because it's big, it's colossal because it spans more than one floor. So there are 2 stories here, that's why we call it that. We have our central pavilion and our end pavilions. So this is where the Place Vendôme is getting its ideas for how to make its matching facades. And now we're going to see this move into other French palaces and even palaces beyond the boundaries of France because of what it symbolizes. It's the most powerful monarchy in the world at the time, and everyone wants to get in on it. So everyone's going to try to copy it a little bit. Just to give you a sense of the scale, this is what a person looks like down here. So it is absolutely enormous, right? This is truly colossal in both sense of the word. And it has a little moat going around it, right? Because recall, this was a fortress, so the original fortress moat is still there. But we're giving it some more elegance, so it doesn't look so medieval by giving it a facelift of a Renaissance facade. On an urban scale, what do we see change? So this is how the Louvre looked like before, where we see the original fortress, Catherine de Medici's little palace over here, and then we have Henry IV's addition connecting the 2. So this is the point we're at before, and then this is what it turns into afterwards. On an urban scale, what do we see as different? What new addition do we have in the palace? How do we know it's a palace? So I'll go back to it so you can see what it looked like before and what it looks like now. What are those?
Garden.
Those are the new palace gardens. So the easiest way to tell that we're looking at a palace is by looking at its gardens during this time period. Anytime you see a major piece of greenery, usually with geometric forms, you're going to be 99% sure you are looking at the property of a palace, and a palace that specifically was made during the 17th or 18th century, modeled after what is going on right here. So you can see a little close-up of it, the large extent of it, right? So that's the original Louvre over here. This is the palace Catherine made, and these are the new grounds of it. Now, Versailles, of course, is the ultimate example of this. Remember that this little thing right here is the actual Palace of Versailles. And then these are the grounds of Versailles. And I've shown you many aerial images of it before to give you a sense of the scale. You can see this. It pretty much is like a fourth of the size of Paris. So they are absolutely enormous. But based on what you guys learned last week when we looked at Rome, how do we know that this is Baroque planning going on? Right? It's not just that it's a garden, it's a certain type of garden. What do we see in here that tells us that it's an absolutist Baroque? Yes?
It has like a trivium in the center.
Yes, we do have a trivium in the center as we enter the actual palace. Why would we want that? Because any way you come in, it's going to be nicely framed, where we're going to have theatri, or the idea that these ends over here are going to be nicely constructed to hide what's behind them, so that as people arrive, it really does look like the most grand palace in the world. And there's a better view of that trivium, right? So to this day, if you're arriving at the Louvre, you are literally entering on a pretty grand trivium. And notice that we're trying to create symmetry by creating these twin pavilions on the ends over here before you arrive. Now, how else do we know that this is Baroque planning? Because when we look at the landscape, we see geometric forms. Once we get to later centuries, if you guys recall, we talked about picturesque and the idea of creating these natural landscapes. That happens later in time. So we know that this happened before then, meaning that we can date it particularly to the 1600s, where we have triviums, geometric flower parterres, we have really nice arrangements. Right, notice how small a person is. These are enormous designs that we have going on. And to have that, we need a landscape architect, right? So we know that someone with lots of power, with authority, with money created this, which obviously is going to be our French king, Louis XIV, our son king. And so the palace archetype was designed for pleasure and not for defense, right? This is not completely walled up, it does not have turrets, it does not have a moat or bastions. It is a freestanding, beautiful facade with gardens around it. Why? Because at this point, you don't have to worry about being invaded, right? France is a consolidated nation, and by the time your Italians or your Spaniards get into the heart of France, you're gonna have the French army be attacking them miles out from Paris. So there's no way that they could possibly get that close, which gives us the luxury of creating things like a palace. So anytime you see a palace form, you know that there is security as far as defense goes. So we've come a long way since our medieval fortress, right, where we have our city walls and then we have our castle in the center with its own moat, to creating these beautiful displays just out in the countryside. Sometimes they don't even have to be attached to a city. And so the archetype largely gets the facade from the Louvre and then the gardens from Versailles. And that is what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the class, how this ultimately becomes what we call a Germanic palace. So we're going to see a couple of iterations of palaces and how it begins to change. But the original one is from France and it looks like this. So, what's going on in other regions? We can see lots of fragmentation, right? So I told you, France doesn't have to worry because they are consolidated. And if you look at the modern boundaries of France, they're very close to what we see in the purple, right? So they're not really fighting too many wars of annexation, right? They're trying to invade a couple of these, but they're not being actively attacked. They're not getting their land taken away. What we see here is a whole different story, right? So that is going to be our Holy Roman Empire, what becomes Germany. So we're going to refer to them today as the Germanic principalities. And then over here we, of course, have our merchant families. In Italy, they still have issues going on, right? Republic of Venice has gotten bigger. Notice that Ferrara isn't really a thing anymore, so we know that they got taken over at some point. So some changes have happened. But largely, it's a very messy region. And what that tells us is that we have a lot of little monarchs, usually dukes, princes, prince-bishops, that are going to be competing with each other to show that they are the most powerful. Specifically, if we look at this pink region, that is going to be our Habsburg Empire. So that's going to be modern day Hungary, it's going to be Austria, Slovakia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, and if you know anything about that region, they not only don't speak the same language, they don't even write in the same alphabet, right? So it is a very diverse region as far as cultural differences go, meaning that people don't like to be in the crown of the Habsburg Empire. They hate being there. So we have lots of internal wars going on because most of these people do not identify as being Austrian, because it's the Austrian crown that has conquered all of them. The Hungarians are not invited to court. Their language is treated as being barbaric. So you can imagine there's a lot of upset people inside of here. So Hungary, compared to France, has another problem on its hands. Not only is it fighting with all its neighbors, including the Ottoman Empire, it's also fighting with the people inside of its boundaries. France doesn't have that problem. Everyone here has a common ancestor that they refer to as the Franks. They believe that they are all French. There is a sense of Frenchness. Here, not so much, and because boundaries are quickly shifting, you know, one day you could be Austrian, and then the next day you wake up and you're going to be Bavarian. And so you don't really have a sense of loyalty to monarchies or crowns in this region. Now, because of that, our monarchs are going to be overly sensitive, and they're going to really be hyper-focused on creating palaces that tell us the opposite thing. They're telling us, or they're trying to tell us, we are a very secure, prosperous nation, right? We have enlightened individuals, when in reality, that is not what is going on. But they want it to appear that way. And so they're going to borrow what France is doing, and they're going to make it their own. So we're going to hop over to Vienna first, which is going to be our Habsburg capital. Now at this point, I hope you know how to recognize that this is the center of our original development in Vienna out here. And we can tell because it's a nice ring formation. Sorry, so this is a map in around the 1800s. This is what the original fortress of Vienna looks like with its bastions. So we know that Renaissance Vienna was really just this red piece here. Over time, over the next 300 years, we do have it spread out. And where do you guys believe that the palace is located in Vienna, based on the urban fabric that we see?
Green space on the bottom.
Yes, so we have the green space, Schönbrunn, which is the name of our next palace. So like Versailles, right, they're trying to copy them, not only in the style, but also where it's located. They're going, well, if the French didn't put theirs in the middle, we're not going to do that either. We're going to put ours on the outskirts too, right, to have similar ideas, to have a similarly sized palace with palace grounds. And this is what it looks like. Now we can see this isn't quite as refined as Versailles, right? One, it's not symmetrical. We have a whole lot more land on this side, and then we have like this extra addition that we don't see over here, which tells us that they're not quite at the level of the French monarchy. It's also much smaller in size, right? This is really like a half, maybe a third of the size of Versailles, but they want us to think that they're equal to Versailles. This is the palace down here, right? So it's still quite small in comparison to the grounds. But I'm showing you this image. This was their original plan. When they hired the architect, they were like, give us absolutely everything you can think of, and this is what the architect created. So notice the palace is this thing right here, right? This is what they actually constructed. But they had planned to make these extra wings, these extra pediments, right? We have ramps and stairs and fountains and then triumphal columns at the end and then pavilions. None of this ended up being constructed. Not even the King of France can afford to do this, much less the Habsburg Empire, who's focused on suppressing its own internal revolutions. And so we end up with this instead, right? Just kind of the central part of the palace. It's still very nice. And notice that they are stealing ideas over from the Louvre. Central pavilion and pavilions, rustic base, and colossal colonnade. But it looks a little different, right? It's not as grand, right? It doesn't have these protruding columns. It's much more in the Germanic style. I told you last semester that Germany, the Germanic lands, love the use of paint. And we see that on this facade. Rather than using the raw stone, they do paint the facade. So you come in, right? We have our nice court, similar to Versailles. But recall, Versailles had this extra little step so that it ended right here. So you get off your carriage, and then you had to walk by foot so that you were humbled by the French king, and then you would be received inside. Over here, we don't quite see that level of planning, right? You can roll up right up to the main stairway in your carriage. On the back side, we see the grounds, so we still have our central pavilion. And we have our Baroque planning, right? Now what we see here is a masterful use of landscape planning and the creation of an illusion. So what we see back here is a folly. What do you think that folly is trying to emulate? What does it look like?
Temple?
Sort of. It's trying to emulate the palace itself, right? So it's trying to create this illusion that there is a twin palace on the other side of the gardens, when in reality, this is a much smaller folly piece. And what this is doing is creating a false perspective. So we believe that the grounds are much larger than they actually are. Right, so look at how this makes you feel. If you are walking through here and you have this high, rich density in the foreground, and then you see this long promenade that ends on this folly back here, you almost believe that this is an endless, type of avenue all the way down your gardens. And the reason they do that is to make it look larger than it actually is, because when we look at it, you can see that by elevating this piece here, you are trying to extend the eye, right? So it looks like it goes past the horizon, when in reality, it's not as large as Versailles is. Had they not added this hill back here or added that folly, you would be sort of confused as to where it ends, because you'd just be looking at some tree wall back here and you'd be like, okay, I guess that's where the gardens end, right? Versus in Versailles, when you look down the whole garden, Lake of Versailles, you can't even tell what's all the way back there because it is so extensive, it gets lost in the fog. Here, you can clearly tell where the end is. So rather than allowing people to assume it's just not as large, they create a termination to create a sense of mystery and a sense of elegance at the end of it. So that's what it looks like. You can see they're, again, emulating that facade, central pavilion, colossal colonnade, more or less. It is open because it is a folly, but we're trying to give this idea that it's almost like a twin palace is at the other end of it. Another Germanic palace where we see a new innovation of sorts is the Schloss Pommersfelden. So this is going to be located in Bavaria, another region. So this is a whole other monarch that is now trying to show his power rivals the Austrian and the French crown. Schloss, by the way, just means palace in German. So what we see here is a very interesting protrusion on the facade. Recall that the French facade is perfectly flat, right? It's flat all the way along. It has its central pavilion, but it doesn't pop out like this one. So now we're seeing that this idea of a grand stair becomes a thing, and it becomes such a large idea that it literally spills out of the facade and becomes articulated as a whole separate vestibule. And so the Germanic palace archetype contains this protrusion for a stair. Why do you think that the stair becomes so important, based on the things we've learned about stairs in this class? Yeah, so it's basically to impress your visitors. Remember, in Rome, they had the Scala Regia, which I told you had these long and very short steps, which makes it feel more grand. And recall in Versailles, the king wouldn't even greet you at the stair, right? You had to go through all these rooms to go meet him. And so in the Germanic palace, what we have is a combination of these ideas. Right, so there's the stair vestibule. You come here with your carriage, you get off. And then we have this. So this is the standard vestibule, cut section of one of these palaces. You come in with your carriage, you enter a grand vestibule, which is this whole area here. You then are met with your grand stair, which gives you two options. You could either go up into the formal grand salon, which is where you're going to have your throne room of sorts, you're going to have your political, more important meetings, or you have your secondary option, which is to go down the stairs into the gardens. So this is if you're just coming to visit your friends, you're going to have a garden party, more casual encounter, you're going to go down this way. So we see that the vestibule of these Germanic palaces becomes a symbol of hierarchy, a symbol of function. What are you here to do? So this is the Schloss Pommersfelden, just to give you an idea. That's the whole vestibule where you walk in. This is the portion of the grand stair. You either go up into the Grand Salon, or you go down into what we call the Sala Terrena. Sala Terrena means garden room, and it's called garden room, obviously, because it leads into the garden. So our Sala Terrena is going to become our transition between the indoor and the outdoor spaces of our palace. So to give you an idea of what these spaces look like, this is the grand vestibule, which you can see spans multiple stories, right? On the outside, it looks like it's about 3 stories. On the inside, it's really just one multi-story space. It's a huge atrium. Again, sense of grandness. Look at the tread of those stairs compared to the height of it. These are nice and comfortable for a courtier. And what happens on this one is, if you are a duke or a bishop or whatever you are, you come out as the patron of the home. And then let's say you have a nobody come visit you. You're gonna stay up here and they're gonna have to walk by themselves up to greet you. But let's say you have the King of France, who we know is superior to everyone else. You are gonna come down all the way down to the floor and humble yourself, and then you're going to come up with the King of France. You're not gonna let him walk by himself. And so this becomes a part of how they run things in the court in Germanic palaces. And once again, because the German principalities are so broken up, constantly competing with each other, we do need to have this sort of movement here to show I either respect you or you have to respect me. The French king does not have to have that because he knows everyone must respect him. There is absolutely no one higher than him, meaning he doesn't need to have all this. He can just wait in the throne room for them. So assuming you go through these top doors up here, you go into the Grand Salon, which looks like this. And we can see it's a very nice formal space, nice patterns, sort of a Baroque look on the top portion. But let's say you go through the bottom, you go into this room, which is the Sala Terrena, which is usually made to look like a sort of underwater grotto. Because again, it's a transition between the actual built environment and the landscape. And so they're using more Greek mythology inside of here, right? They're gonna use gods like Dionysus, like Pan, versus up here where we have a more Christian iconography, because the Christian iconography is more serious and the Greek iconography is much more fun, right? This is where you're gonna go if you're gonna have a nice, pleasant time at the palace and not do any business. Now you'll notice that Vienna has a secondary palace, right? So if you're really intent and you're looking at it, you will notice that there is another thing going on here. And so you might ask yourself, why are there 2? If there's only one monarchy, why are there 2 palaces? Well, the size should give us a first clue that this does not necessarily belong to the main ruler, which tells us that it must belong to some sort of duke, some sort of war hero, a military leader. And why would a military leader need something as big as this? Because again, the Habsburg Empire is constantly having wars around its boundaries. And so if we have some military hero get a big chunk of land for us, you're gonna be very thankful to him and you're gonna build him his own palace. Not as grand as yours, but nice, right? So we see that the land in this case is not symmetrical at all. We have this weird triangular addition. But we have this little palace down here, which is made in what we now call the standard Germanic palace, right? So this is no longer the French palace archetype because we have this bulbousness on the central pavilion. And if you also look at the language of it a little bit with more detail, we don't have a central temple pediment. We do not have clean Corinthian columns, right? This is looking much more German. So what began as a borrowing of an archetype eventually evolved into becoming its own archetype. This is the entrance to the palace, right? So you notice that there's a ramp up here where our carriages could have come, so it's extra comfortable. You don't even have to go up the stairs. And then you enter the grand staircase, very similar to what we saw in the other schloss. So in this case, notice that the style we're using is what we call Rococo. So if you've ever heard the term Rococo and Baroque used interchangeably, they are very different. Rococo is like Baroque light, right? So everything is usually going to be in pastels or whites and very low relief. And this was a sort of direct answer to the heaviness of the Baroque because people got tired of how heavy it looked. They wanted something a little bit lighter and cleaner. So we have the Rococo emerge. We have our grand salon, once again, we have Christian symbols on it. And then we have our sala terrena on the bottom. In this case, we're using a sort of mythological reference. Does anyone recognize who this is? Yes, it's Atlas. So we call these Atlas columns, right? So if you remember back when we talked about Greece last semester, we had our maiden porch, which looked like women, the caryatids. And they're, very elegant. They do not look like they're struggling under the weight of a whole temple. But Atlas is, if you don't know the myth, Atlas was made to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. And so in this case, they're carrying the weight of the palace. Because remember, the sala terrena is on our first floor, so they're carrying the grand salon on their shoulders. And then the last one we're going to talk about today is going to be Würzburg's residence. We're going to analyze the plan really quickly since we have a couple minutes. Right away, what do you guys think is the ruling structure of this town? What numbers?
10.
8.
It is 10 now, but what was it originally?
8.
It's going to be 2 or 5. We're looking at the center of town. So if you don't see the pattern, we have a pentagon going on right here, right? And so this tells us that this was our outermost boundary during the Renaissance, meaning that this is the original core here. This is a fortress, true, right? And the fortress was used to defend it, but notice that the fortress has bastions, which tells us that's a later addition. So originally we have this, and what do you notice is the shape that we see on number 2? We have a short arm intersecting a long arm. What is that? Yes, so we have a church in the center, which means who rules this town?
Bishop.
Yes, so this is a bishop town. And number 5 is also another type of church. And I'll show you all the churches that they have here. Würzburg is called the city of churches because of how many of them it has. So there's our original pentagon right here. Now you'll notice that we have these interesting cloisters on the end. Over here we have one, and then down here we have another one. What do you guys think those are? Religious cloisters on the outskirts of town on opposite ends. Yes, those are going to be our mendicant churches. We have one here and we have one here. In this case, we're going to have the Franciscans and the Augustinians. So not the Dominicans, but Augustinians in this case. Before today, we're going to be focusing on this region here, which is going to be our palace. In this case, it's not for a duke or a prince, but it is for a prince-bishop. So at some point, we have a bishop who needs to be granted a title to be the ruler or the leader of an area in Germany. And in order to have more power, what they do is they grant them a royal title. So now they're not only a bishop, but they're also a prince. And so we see that the two come together. And remember, bishops can't have kids because they're in the church, so they have to be granted this title as new bishops get inducted. And because they are not princes, they have to show that they have some level of authority by creating a palace for themselves. So that is why the residence is not for a king, but for a prince-bishop in this case. How do we know it's Germanic? We have our vestibule popping out in the center here, and in this case, this is one of the most grand, or not palazzos, palaces that you will ever see. This here is the entirety of this staircase, right? So whereas other palaces, the staircase is just this region, in the residence, it's this entire thing over here. Notice that this is very large compared to the scale of the other ones. It has all these extra wings over here. Right? So not only do we have one nice facade here and then on the back, we also have them on the sides. And then this right here is a theater. So it has a whole separate theater included inside of it. It is a huge compound. Now we're going to be looking at that staircase, right? So this is where we enter. We know it's Germanic because it's missing our central pediment. This is the grand staircase, right? So this is the most grand one of all. And that fresco that we see on top is the biggest fresco in the world, which shows us the earthly world, right, where we have all of our different leaders from different time periods, right, and we see that manifested through the architecture. And then we see the depiction of the heavens and of God as the supreme leader, which is, of course, an allegory to the fact that our Prince Bishop is the supreme leader of Würzburg. So nothing in here is ever coincidence or done simply for the love of, a religion. It's always some sort of symbolism. This is going to be our staircase. In this case, carriages come in here, they drive you all the way to the base of the parapet here, and then they drive off. So here we have 2 stairs, right? And notice how long these are, right? So these are even longer and shallower than the ones at the other Schlosses, which tells us that this is an even grander one. I did want to show you a couple of the other rooms. This here is the Grand Salon. Pay attention to the iconography in it because it's not going to be Greek, it's going to be Christian. Right, so we have the crowning of the king, so the divine right of the Prince Bishop. And then notice the super cool detail. That is not fabric, right? This is made out of plaster. And what they do is they paint the top side of it to look like a fabric and leave the bottom white so that it emulates the capes of kings. Right, so super cool details all over the place. And again, we know it's dramatic because of their love for paint. We have another scene of someone being crowned in this case. And then I want to show you guys the Sala Terrena, which is down here. So notice it's shorter, right? And we're using Greek icons, right? So these are all symbols from Greek mythology, which notice have more natural themes because this is the transition between indoor and outdoor spaces. And once again, notice the masterful use of sculpting. It literally looks like the painting is bleeding into real life because of the way that this is sculpted. These are not tassels, these are all made by hand and they are plaster. So we know that whoever built this is also incredibly wealthy. And then lastly, I did want to show you this other room, just because it's so crazy. So this is made of mirrors instead of plaster, and then it's gilded on top, which again tells us that whoever owns this is very wealthy. But then I want you to look at the images on the top. We have a dragon, we have what looks like people from the Indian subcontinent. What is this an example of that we talked about last semester? What style is this? So this is exoticism. Remember, exoticism was when we had the Europeans go out to the Asian continent specifically, and then they would come back and they would depict what they believed was Chinese architecture. And we can see they're mixing all sorts of cultures here, which is why we just call it chinoiserie, or what they call Chinese stuff, because they just don't care enough to make the difference between them. And notice the type of room that this is in. Right? This is not a formal room. This is a room that is meant for pleasure, maybe for smoking. So because they are using unserious functions in this room, they are equally using what they call unserious forms of architecture. Right? All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I'll see you guys on Thursday.